Interesting development. I want to get a little deeper into this. Chris, thanks a million. Hans, always great to hear from both of you. I want to turn now to the man I introduced you to a few moments ago, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Russia and a former NATO Deputy Secretary General. Sir, let's just pick up where Hans left off. Annihilate? The British Empire couldn't annihilate fighters in Afghanistan. The Russian Empire, the Soviet Union couldn't do it. And we're talking about 3,000 more soldiers. I mean, this is just, this seems like, to be generous, wishful thinking.
Well, it is a very frustrating situation because we have been in Afghanistan for a decade and a half, and we've transferred most of the responsibility from American and NATO troops to the Afghans themselves, and they've been struggling. They've taken huge casualties. The Taliban has increased its control of some of the territory. And so when the commander there says it's a stalemate, he's absolutely right. But the question is whether America wants to invest more blood and treasure in Afghanistan. The objective in the past was to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for terrorism. I think that's still a reasonable objective. It may take a few more troops for a short period of time, but we have to be careful about turning this into the endless war.
Right. So what's the line that one draws between a failed state and a safe haven for terrorism? And that's, just to be clear to our audience, that's a very different line than annihilating the Taliban or annihilating al-Qaeda in a region that no one's been able to conquer.
Yeah. No, it's, well, safe haven versus failed state, that's maybe a subject for political scientists to debate. But the fact of the matter is the Taliban is still very tenacious. And the aim in the past, both under the Bush administration and under the Obama administration, was to ultimately arrive at a political settlement in which the Taliban will lay down their arms in return for some kind of role in the government going forward. I think that's still the only realistic outcome. You have to put more pressure on them in order to get them to negotiate, and that's where some small surge may make sense. But we have to be careful about an open-ended commitment, or we'll be in there for another decade.
So some people don't think that that kind of deal, that's a deal with the devil. But in fact, there are examples where it's not the Taliban, but Islamists and other more democratic groups have come together. Tunisia would be an example. It's tentative, but it's actually kind of working.
That's right. Ultimately, you're not going to be able to eliminate every single fighter or completely extinguish their ideology. So you have to find a way to find a pragmatic compromise. Right now, they think they're on the upswing, though. The Taliban, I think, aren't going to negotiate today. So some additional pressure, more equipment and training for the Afghan armed forces is necessary, and maybe some additional U.S. counterterrorism capabilities to reduce their potential to continue to spread through the country. So, but a political solution has to be the way this story ends. To be clear,
America helped give birth to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan with its efforts to arm a group of people who were fighting off what was then the Soviet Union. So America and Russia have been at odds in Afghanistan. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was on the Today Show this morning, where she talked about the potential Russian role in all of this with Matt Lauer. Listen with me.
Do you worry about a collision course with Russia? Because, as you know, it's been reported that the Russians are sending arms to the Taliban. So are U.S. troops on the ground there going to be fight Russian-armed Taliban troops on the ground there?
Well, one of the first conversations needs to be with Vladimir Putin, and to say, do you really want to get back into Afghanistan after what happened to you before in Afghanistan? There's no reason for the Russians to be arming the Taliban. And so that conversation needs to take place, and I'm sure that when Secretary Tillerson meets with the Foreign Minister Lavrov, that will come up.
That's really interesting. Do you agree? Does any conversation about an increased presence in Afghanistan start with a conversation with Russia to say, please don't arm the other side?
Well, I think we do have to talk to the Russians. We also have to talk to our allies. So let's not forget that NATO and NATO countries, as well as countries outside of NATO, have been in there for a decade and a half with us. So they need to be consulted, too. But yes, we have to talk to the Russians, who did indeed end up in a quagmire themselves and had to pull out at the end of the 80s. if they're arming the Taliban, and it's not confirmed, but the commanders themselves are convinced of it, then they're playing with fire, and they're just going to make a bad situation worse, including for themselves, because this could spread northward into Central Asia, which they say is an area of vital interest for them.
I think your view on this is very interesting, because talking about annihilating things in Afghanistan hasn't worked for any very well-armed empire in the history of the world, so maybe an option B is the best solution. Sir, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Ambassador